Imagine a 13-year-old boy in Brooklyn, standing by his bedroom window, quietly watching the neighborhood wise guys pull up and park their gleaming Cadillacs across the street. These men wore suits that cost more than most families earned in a whole year. Their shoes were polished so brightly they looked like mirrors. Their confidence flowed off them like heat from summer pavement. That kid pressed his face against the glass and made a choice that would shape the rest of his life. He decided he would rather be a gangster than the President of the United States. His name was Henry Hill. And this is the story of how he lived every gangster's dream and nightmare. Before we jump into this amazing true story, where are you right now as you listen to this? And what time is it? Are you lying in bed letting the weight of the day sink into your bones? Are you driving through empty streets watching the world sleep around you? I want you to get comfortable because Henry Hill's story is going to take us on a trip through the golden age of organized crime, through the sparkling heights of criminal success, and into the dark heart of what it means to give up everything for a dream that turns out to be a nightmare. The year was 1955 in East New York. Brooklyn was a neighborhood where dreams went to fade away, unless your dreams involved breaking the law. The streets were narrow paths of ambition and desperation, where honest work barely paid the rent and easy money flowed like water through the cracks of society. For a kid like Henry Hill, born on June 11, 1943, those streets would become both his school and his jail. Henry wasn't born into the mob. He was born right next to it. His father was a struggling Irish construction worker who drank too much and earned too little. His mother, an Irish-Italian woman with dreams bigger than her life, worked as a seamstress, her fingers moving like lightning across cloth, while her mind wandered to better times that always seemed just out of reach. They lived in a cramped apartment above a shoe store, where the smell of leather and glue mixed with the smell of his mother's cooking and his father's cigarettes. But across the street stood the Bamboo Lounge, and that changed everything. East New York in the 1950s was a melting pot bubbling with possibility and danger. Italian families who had moved here decades earlier now controlled the neighborhood's underground economy with an iron fist wrapped in a silk glove. Irish families like the Hills struggled to find their place in this new setup, caught between the honest world that offered little and the dishonest world that seemed to offer everything. Henry was 11 when he first noticed them. The men in expensive suits who commanded respect with just a look, who never seemed to worry about money, who walked through the neighborhood like they owned it. Because in many ways they did. The Bamboo Lounge wasn't just a restaurant and bar. It was the headquarters of Paul Vario's crew, one of the most successful operations in the Lucchese crime family. Paul Vario himself was a man who understood power in all its forms, the power of money, of fear, of loyalty, and most importantly, the power of family. Not just blood family, but the chosen family of men who lived by a code older than America itself. From his bedroom window, Henry would watch these men arrive in their Cadillacs and Lincolns, their wives wrapped in furs despite the summer heat, their children dressed like little princes and princesses. He watched them laugh loudly, eat heartily, and live without the constant worry that bothered every other family in the neighborhood. While his father came home each night covered in concrete dust and exhaustion, these men seemed to float above the gritty reality of working-class Brooklyn. Young Henry didn't understand the violence, the threats, or the fear that kept this world running smoothly. He only saw the results: respect, money, and a kind of freedom that seemed impossible to reach through normal means. The big moment came on a scorching summer day in 1954. Henry was walking past the Bamboo Lounge when one of the men called out to him. The man was Tutti Vario, Paul's son, and he needed someone to run a simple errand. Henry's heart pounded as he walked up to the group of wise guys. Their gold jewelry caught the afternoon sun like tiny lighthouses. "Hey, kid," Tutti said, his voice carrying the authority of someone much older than his years. "You want to make $5? $5 was a fortune to an 11-year-old boy whose father brought home maybe $40 a week when work was steady. Henry nodded eagerly, not caring what the job might involve. The errand was simple. Deliver a message to a bookie 3 blocks away and bring back the answer. Henry ran those 3 blocks faster than he'd ever run in his life, his sneakers slapping against the hot pavement, his mind racing with possibilities. When he returned with the message, Tutti handed him a crisp $5 bill and something even more valuable. A nod of approval. "You did good, kid. What's your name?" "Henry Hill." "Well, Henry Hill, you ever want to make some more money? You know where to find us." That night, Henry lay in his narrow bed, listening to his parents argue about unpaid bills. And he rubbed the $5 bill in his pocket. He had found his calling, and it wasn't in any classroom or construction site. Over the next few months, Henry became a regular sight around the Bamboo Lounge. At first, his jobs were simple: running messages, getting coffee, sweeping floors, but each task taught him something about the complicated world he was entering. He learned that respect was everything. The way a man carried himself, the way he spoke, the way he handled both success and disappointment. All of this mattered more than anything he had ever learned in school. He watched how Paul Vario commanded attention without raising his voice, how a simple look could end an argument, how loyalty was rewarded and betrayal was punished quickly and completely. He learned about money, not just how to make it, but how to spend it. These men didn't count pennies or clip coupons. They bought the best of everything: food, clothes, cars, because they understood that how you looked was what you were in their world. If you looked successful, you were successful. If you looked weak, you were dead. Most importantly, he learned about family. Not the blood family that shared his cramped apartment, but the chosen family of the crew. These men would die for each other, kill for each other, and share their last dollar with each other. It was a brotherhood that went beyond ethnic backgrounds, money situations, and personal differences. If you were in, you were all the way in. Henry's real education began when he started skipping school to work at the Bamboo Lounge. His parents were angry at first, but their anger faded when Henry began bringing more money into the house than his father brought home from construction work. His mother stopped asking questions when she noticed the quality of the food Henry brought home from the restaurant. His father stopped complaining when Henry paid to have their car fixed without asking where the money came from. Henry's first real taste of power came during the taxi stand incident, an event that would become famous in his own mind and a warning story in the minds of those who saw it. Henry was 13, a young man working for Paul Vario's crew for nearly 2 years. He had proven himself reliable, careful, and eager to learn. But he was still just a kid from across the street, not a real member of anything important. The trouble started when a local taxi dispatcher named Bruno began giving Henry a hard time about parking in front of the taxi stand when he was running errands for the crew. Bruno was a big man with a bigger mouth, the kind of neighborhood bully who picked on kids because he was too scared to face anyone his own size. For weeks, Bruno bothered Henry every time he parked near the taxi stand. He would bang on car windows, yell insults, and threaten to call the police. Henry put up with it because he had been taught to avoid unnecessary fights. But one day, Bruno went too far. That day, Henry was sitting in one of Paul Vario's cars, waiting to pick up a package when Bruno stormed out of the taxi dispatch office and started screaming at him. The language was dirty. The accusations were false. And worst of all, Bruno grabbed Henry by the shirt and physically pulled him from the car. That night, Henry told Tutti Vario what had happened. He didn't ask for help or demand revenge. He simply reported the incident the way he had been taught to report everything that might affect the crew's business. 2 days later, Henry watched from his bedroom window as 3 men walked into the taxi dispatch office. 15 minutes later, they walked out and Bruno never bothered Henry again. In fact, Bruno never bothered anyone again. He suddenly developed a strong interest in being somewhere else whenever members of Vario's crew were in the neighborhood. Henry learned a deep lesson that day. There were different kinds of power in the world, and the kind that came from being part of something larger than yourself was the most exciting of all. He had said a few words to the right person, and a problem that had seemed impossible simply vanished. It was like magic, but better, it was real. As Henry's reputation grew within the organization, he started meeting the men who would shape the next 25 years of his life. These weren't just criminals or co-workers. They became the closest thing to brothers he would ever know. Jimmy Burke was the first to really notice Henry's potential. Jimmy was an Irishman in an Italian world, a spot that required twice as much cleverness and 3 times as much toughness to keep. He had earned his place through a mix of intelligence, brutality, and an almost supernatural ability to plan and carry out complicated crimes. Jimmy stood about 5'8" tall, but his presence filled any room he entered. His hair was always perfectly styled, his clothes perfectly fitted, and his eyes missed nothing. He had the kind of smile that could put you at ease or terrify you. Depending on the situation, when Jimmy smiled at you, you were either about to make a lot of money or about to die. The kid's got potential. Jimmy told Paul Vario one evening as Henry cleaned tables in the bamboo lounge, "He listens. He learns, and he keeps his mouth shut. That's rarer than you might think." Tommy DeSimone was Jimmy's protege, and in many ways his opposite. Where Jimmy was calculating and controlled, Tommy was explosive and unpredictable. He was also one of the funniest men Henry had ever met, capable of keeping a room laughing for hours with his impressions and stories. But Tommy's humor had a dangerous edge to it. He could go from making you laugh to making you bleed in the space of a heartbeat. Tommy was movie star handsome, with dark hair and eyes that sparkled with intelligence and meanness in equal measure. He dressed like a fashion model and fought like a wild animal. His temper was famous, his loyalty was total, and his ability to be violent had no limits. He became Henry's closest friend, and eventually one of his greatest fears. These men, along with Paul Vario and his son Tutti, formed the core of Henry's new family. They taught him how to dress, how to carry himself, how to talk, and most importantly, how to think like a wise guy. The lessons went far beyond simple criminal skills. They were about adopting a whole way of seeing the world based on strength, loyalty, and the understanding that normal society was for suckers. Living by the code of Cosa Nostra meant more than just following rules. It meant embracing a philosophy that turned traditional right and wrong upside down. In Henry's world, the government was the enemy. Honest work was for fools, and loyalty to the family came before every other duty. The first rule was silence. You never spoke to the police, the FBI, or any other law enforcement agency, no matter what the results might be. You could be arrested, put on trial, found guilty, and sentenced to life in prison, but you never worked with the authorities. This wasn't just about avoiding the label of informant. It was about keeping the whole system strong. The second rule was respect. You showed proper honor to those above you in the chain of command, protected those below you, and never forgot your place in the organization. Showing disrespect could get you killed, but it was often preceded by warnings, beatings, or other forms of correction. The third rule was earning. Everyone was expected to bring in money for the family, whether through legal businesses, illegal operations, or some mix of both. You gave a portion of your earnings to your bosses, and they gave a portion to their bosses, all the way up the chain of command. The fourth rule was loyalty. You never betrayed a member of the family, never stole from the family, and never did anything that could bring unwanted attention to the family's activities. This loyalty was total and forever. It didn't end when you went to prison, got old, or wanted out of the life. For Henry, these rules weren't limiting. They were freeing. They provided structure in a world that otherwise seemed messy and unfair. They guaranteed that hard work would be rewarded, that loyalty would be returned, and that he would always have a place where he belonged. There was one part of the code that would always limit Henry's rise in the organization: his background. To become a made man, a full member of the Mafia with all the rights and protections that status gave you, you had to be 100% Italian. Henry's Irish father made him forever unable to reach the highest levels of the organization. This limit stung more than Henry first realized. He could work for the family, earn for the family, and even kill for the family, but he could never truly be part of the family in the way that mattered most. He would always be an associate, never a member. But Paul Vario helped Henry understand that there were also advantages to his position. Associates often had more freedom in their operations, less attention from law enforcement, and fewer limits on their activities. Made men were bound by extra rules and traditions that didn't apply to associates. In many ways, Henry had the best of both worlds: the protection and chances of family membership without the complete loss of independence that full membership required. You don't need to be made to be successful, Paul told Henry one evening as they sat in the back room of the Bamboo Lounge. Some of the richest guys I know are associates. Some of the most powerful guys I know are associates. What matters is what you do with the chances you're given. Henry took this advice to heart, but the knowledge that he would never be truly equal to men like Tommy DeSimone, who could become a member despite being far less reliable, would bother him for the rest of his criminal career. By the time Henry turned 16, he was no longer the wide-eyed kid who had run his first errand for $5. He was an experienced member of Paul Vario's crew, trusted with more and more important duties, and aware of the kind of information that could get a person killed for knowing too much. He had learned to dress like a wise guy: expensive suits, silk ties, gold jewelry, and shoes that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He had learned to talk like a wise guy, confident, direct, and always aware of who was listening. He had learned to think like a wise guy. Every meeting was a possible opportunity. Every relationship was a possible advantage. And every problem could be solved if you used the right mix of intelligence, money, and force. Most importantly, he had learned to live like a wise guy. He ate in the finest restaurants, dated the most beautiful girls, and commanded respect from men twice his age. He had money in his pocket, respect on the street, and a future that seemed limited only by his own ambition and creativity. The change was complete. Henry Hill was no longer a kid from East New York, dreaming of something better. He was something better, at least by the standards of the world he had chosen to live in. As the 1950s came to a close, Henry stood on the edge of adulthood with advantages that most young men could only imagine. He had connections, experience, and most importantly, the complete trust of one of the most successful crews in New York. The stage was set for the next part of his life, the rise to the top of the criminal world. But first, he had to survive his teenage years in a business where mistakes were often deadly and second chances were rarely given. The kid from Brooklyn was about to become a man in a world where being a man was measured not by age or wisdom, but by the ability to succeed in the space between law and chaos. As the 1960s began, Henry Hill was no longer the eager kid running errands for pocket change. At 17, he had become an important part of Paul Vario's operation, trusted with duties that would have scared most adults. The Bamboo Lounge had become his second home, and the men who gathered there had become more than coworkers. They were his chosen family, tied together by shared secrets and mutual need. The crew's operations had grown a lot since Henry first started hanging around. What had begun as traditional neighborhood rackets, loan sharking, numbers running, and protection had grown into a complex criminal business with branches reaching into legal businesses across Brooklyn and Queens. Paul Vario had always been a thinker, understanding that the future of organized crime lay not just in violence and threats, but in the smooth mixing of legal and illegal operations. Henry's role in this growth was crucial. His youth and relatively clean appearance made him perfect for operations that needed someone who wouldn't immediately be suspected of criminal activity. He could walk into banks, meet with businessmen, and carry out transactions without drawing the attention that more obvious wise guys might attract. One of Henry's first big jobs involved the crew's move into the air cargo business at John F. Kennedy Airport, JFK, as it would later be known, was a gold mine of opportunity for anyone with the connections and creativity to use it. Millions of dollars in goods passed through the airport daily, much of it poorly secured and not carefully watched. The airport jobs started small. Henry would drive to JFK with legal paperwork and pick up shipments that had been accidentally sent to the crew's warehouse. The goods, electronics, clothing, jewelry, anything valuable and easy to sell would then disappear into the crew's selling network, sold to legal businesses that Paul Vario either owned or controlled. The beauty of the operation was its simplicity. No violence was needed. No obvious crimes were committed, and the victims, usually big companies or insurance firms, often didn't discover their losses for weeks or months. By the time they realized what had happened, the goods were long gone, and the paper trail led nowhere. Henry proved himself excellent at this kind of work. He had a natural ability to appear honest, to befriend the right people, and to spot opportunities that others might miss. His reputation within the crew grew quickly, as did his ability to earn money. The Air France robbery would become the model for many of Henry's future successes. Careful planning, inside information, and perfect execution. The job came together in the spring of 1963 when Henry was just shy of his 20th birthday. The opportunity came through one of Henry's contacts at JFK, a cargo supervisor who had been carefully befriended over months of patient relationship building. The supervisor, whose gambling debts to the crew had made him willing to cooperate, gave detailed information about a particularly valuable shipment scheduled to arrive on an Air France cargo flight. The shipment contained nearly $500,000 in cash, money being moved between European banks and their American partners. In 1963, this was an almost unthinkable fortune, the kind of score that could set a crew up for years. Jimmy Burke took the lead in planning the robbery, with Henry serving as his main assistant. The plan they created was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its success. Instead of trying to steal the money from the heavily secured cargo area, they would grab it during the move to the armored car that would take it to its final stop. The key was timing. The crew had a small window, maybe 10 minutes, during which the money would be unprotected. They would need to overpower the guards, grab the cash, and vanish before airport security could react. On the morning of the robbery, Henry felt a mix of excitement and fear, unlike anything he had experienced before. This wasn't running an errand or picking up misdirected cargo. This was armed robbery, a serious crime that could result in decades in prison if anything went wrong. But nothing went wrong. The crew's information was perfect. Their timing was flawless, and their execution was professional. In less than 8 minutes, they had overpowered the guards, grabbed the money, and disappeared into the maze of service roads surrounding the airport. No one was seriously hurt. No shots were fired, and no evidence was left behind. Henry's share of the robbery was $50,000, more money than his father had made in the previous 5 years combined. But the money was just the start. The real prize was the reputation he had earned as someone who could be trusted with the crew's most important operations. It was at a party in Queens during the summer of 1963 that Henry first saw Corinne Friedman, and in that moment, everything changed. She was sitting at a table with friends, laughing at something someone had said, and when she looked up and caught his eye, Henry felt something he had never experienced before: complete and instant fascination. Corinne was beautiful in a way that went beyond just physical looks. She had an intelligence that sparkled in her eyes, a confidence that showed in her posture, and a warmth that made everyone around her feel special. She was Jewish, from a respectable middle-class family in Long Island, and she had no idea that the charming young man approaching her table was a professional criminal. Henry's approach was smooth but honest. He asked her to dance, and she said yes. They talked for hours that night about everything except the one subject that filled Henry's daily life. To Corinne, Henry was simply a successful young businessman with expensive taste and excellent manners. Their courtship was a whirlwind of expensive restaurants, Broadway shows, and weekend trips to Atlantic City. Henry spared no expense in impressing Corinne, and she was indeed impressed. She dated other men, but none who seemed to have Henry's confidence, his connections, or his ability to make her feel like the most important person in any room. Corinne knew that Henry's money came from some kind of business involving restaurants and construction, but she didn't ask many questions. In the early 1960s, it wasn't unusual for successful young men to be vague about the details of their work. What mattered was that Henry was generous, attentive, and completely devoted to her. The relationship moved quickly. Within 6 months, Henry was spending more time at Corinne's family home than at his own apartment. Her parents liked him. He was polite, well-dressed, and obviously successful. If they had any doubts about where his money came from, they kept them to themselves. Henry, for his part, was feeling emotions he had never imagined possible. The love he felt for Corinne was different from the loyalty he felt toward the crew. It was personal, private, and completely consuming. For the first time in his life, he had something to live for beyond the immediate satisfaction of criminal success. Henry and Corinne were married on August 29, 1965, in a ceremony that perfectly captured the clash of two worlds. The wedding was held at a country club in Long Island, with Corinne's family and friends sitting on one side of the aisle and Henry's business associates sitting on the other. Paul Vario gave Henry away, serving as a substitute father for the young man who had become like a son to him. Jimmy Burke was the best man, and Tommy DeSimone was among the groomsmen. The whole crew was there, along with representatives from other families who had come to show respect for Paul Vario and his organization. For Corinne's family, The wedding was everything they had hoped for their daughter. Elegant, expensive, and obviously well-funded for Henry's crew. The wedding was a celebration of one of their own, taking another step into respectability and stability. The reception was legendary. The food was catered by the finest restaurants in the city. The wine flowed freely, and the music and dancing lasted until dawn. Envelopes stuffed with cash were pressed into Henry's hands throughout the night. Wedding gifts that added up to more than most people made in a year. But the most important moment of the evening came when Paul Vario pulled Henry aside for a private conversation. "Marriage changes everything," Paul told him. "You have responsibilities now that go beyond the crew. You have to think about her, about the children you'll have, about the kind of life you want to build together." Henry understood what Paul was saying. Marriage represented a form of respectability that could provide cover for his criminal activities. But it also represented weak points that his enemies could use against him. A wife could be threatened, kidnapped, or killed to get to him. Children would be even more vulnerable. "I'll protect her," Henry promised. "I know you will," Paul replied, "but you also have to protect yourself. A dead husband is no good to any wife." After the wedding, Henry and Karen moved to a house in Rockville Center, Long Island, a sign of their entry into respectable suburban society. The house was everything Karen had dreamed of, spacious, well-furnished, and located in a neighborhood where their children could grow up safely and attend good schools. For Henry, the house represented something more complicated. It was proof that his criminal career had been financially successful, but it was also a kind of prison. He now had to maintain two completely separate identities: the loving husband and suburban homeowner, and the increasingly important member of Paul Vario's crew. The balancing act required huge amounts of energy and creativity. Henry would leave the house each morning dressed like any other businessman, kiss Karen goodbye, and drive to his office, which might be the Bamboo Lounge, a warehouse in Queens, or any number of other places where the crew conducted its business. He would spend his day planning robberies, collecting debts, and running the various illegal operations that earned his income, then return home each evening. Ready to discuss Karen's day and help with household decisions, Karen, for her part, began to understand that her husband's work was more complicated and dangerous than she had first realized. The late-night phone calls, the unexplained absences, and the constant presence of cash in large amounts all suggested that Henry's business wasn't completely ordinary. But she also saw the benefits of Henry's success. They lived better than most of their neighbors, vacationed in Europe, and enjoyed access to restaurants and entertainment spots that were usually reserved for the very wealthy. If the source of this wealth was questionable, the quality of life it provided was impossible to deny. The birth of their first child, a daughter named Ruth, in 1966, added another layer of complexity to Henry's double life. Suddenly, he wasn't just responsible for keeping up his own cover story. He was responsible for providing a stable, normal childhood for an innocent child who had no idea that her father was a criminal. The late 1960s brought big changes to the world of organized crime, and Henry found himself at the center of one of the most controversial developments, the move into drug dealing. Traditional wise guys had always looked down on the drug trade, considering it beneath them and too risky for the potential rewards. But as the demand for drugs exploded among middle-class Americans, the profits became impossible to ignore. Paul Vario was at first against the idea of his crew getting involved in drug dealing. The traditional rackets, gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, were safer and more predictable. Drug dealing brought attention from federal law enforcement, attracted unpredictable customers, and broke the old-school code that many wise guys still lived by. But Jimmy Burke saw the future more clearly than his older colleagues. The money in drugs wasn't just good, it was amazing. A successful drug operation could bring in more income in a month than traditional rackets might produce in a year. The risks were big, but for someone with the right connections and the proper caution, those risks could be handled. Henry became Jimmy's main partner in developing the crew's drug operations. His suburban lifestyle and honest appearance made him perfect for dealing with the wealthy customers who were driving the cocaine boom. He could meet clients in nice restaurants, conduct business in office buildings, and transport drugs in vehicles that would never attract police attention. The operation started small. A few ounces of cocaine bought from connections in the city and sold to wealthy suburbanites who wanted to try a drug that was becoming popular in trendy Manhattan circles. But it grew quickly as word spread about the quality of Henry's product and the reliability of his service. Within 2 years, Henry was moving several pounds of cocaine per month, earning hundreds of thousands of dollars in profit. His cut of this income allowed him to live even more extravagantly, while his contributions to the crew's treasury made him increasingly valuable to Paul Vario and Jimmy Burke. But the drug business also brought new pressures and dangers. Federal agents were far more aggressive in going after drug dealers than they were in investigating traditional organized crime activities. The sentences for drug dealing were longer and more certain than those for robbery or extortion. Most importantly, drug dealers were far more likely to cooperate with law enforcement than traditional wise guys. Henry understood these risks, but he also understood that the drug business represented his best chance to build the kind of wealth that would allow him to eventually retire from criminal activity entirely. He began to imagine a future in which he could make his business interests legal, provide for Karen and their growing family, and leave his criminal past behind. By the mid-1970s, Henry had established himself as one of the most successful and reliable members of Paul Vario's crew. His drug operations were bringing in huge profits. His airport connections had helped make dozens of successful robberies happen, and his reputation within the wider organized crime community was solid. It was during this time of success that Jimmy Burke began developing the plan that would become known as the Lufthansa heist, the largest cash robbery in American history up to that time. The job would require everything Henry had learned about airport security, inside information, and complex criminal planning. The opportunity came through one of Henry's longtime contacts at JFK, a cargo supervisor named Louis Werner, who had been providing information about valuable shipments for nearly a decade. Werner had built up large gambling debts to the crew, and his desperation for money made him willing to consider opportunities that he might have turned down under normal circumstances. Werner's information was amazing. Lufthansa, the German airline, was using a vault at JFK to store huge amounts of cash and jewelry being moved between Europe and the United States. On any given day, the vault might contain several $1 million in untraceable money, along with jewelry and other valuables worth millions more. The vault was secure, but not impossible to break into. Werner could give detailed information about the security systems, the guard schedules, and the procedures for getting into the storage area. More importantly, he could make sure that certain security measures would be accidentally disabled on the night of the robbery. Jimmy Burke put together a crew of specialists for the job, experienced robbers who had worked together before and could be trusted to keep quiet no matter what happened. Henry's role was to coordinate the gathering of information and serve as the link between the inside man and the robbery crew. The planning took nearly 6 months. Every detail had to be perfect. The timing, the routes, the equipment, the disposal of evidence, and the division of the money. The crew studied blueprints of the cargo area, watched the security procedures, and practiced every part of the operation until it became routine. The morning of December 11th, 1978, dawned cold and gray, with the kind of bitter wind that made even tough New Yorkers hurry through their daily routines. For Henry Hill, it was the most important day of his criminal career, the day that would either secure his financial future or destroy everything he had built over the previous 20 years. The robbery crew gathered at 3:00 a.m. in a warehouse in Queens, checking their equipment one last time and going over the plan that they had practiced dozens of times over the previous months. Jimmy Burke was calm and focused, showing the kind of professional confidence that had made him famous in criminal circles. Tommy DeSimone was, as always, full of energy, making jokes to ease the tension while checking and rechecking his weapons. Henry's job was to monitor police radio frequencies and coordinate communication between the robbery crew and their lookouts placed around the airport. If anything went wrong, if security discovered the break-in, if police were sent to the scene, if any unexpected problems came up, Henry would be responsible for warning the crew and organizing their escape. At 3:17 a.m., the crew cut through a fence at the edge of the cargo area and made their way to the Lufthansa storage building. Louis Werner had disabled several security cameras and made sure that the guards would be busy in areas far from the target building. The crew had about 30 minutes to complete the robbery before the next security patrol would discover what had happened. The vault contained more money than any of them had imagined possible. Stacks of $100 bills filled multiple bags, along with jewelry, precious stones, and other valuables that sparkled under the bright fluorescent lights. For nearly 20 minutes, the crew worked in near silence, filling duffel bags with cash and trying to figure out the total value of their score. When they finally left, they had stolen about $6 million in cash and jewelry, the largest cash robbery in American history up to that time. The crew's escape was perfect. They went back the way they came through the airport grounds, loaded their vehicles, and vanished into the pre-dawn darkness without running into any security personnel. Henry's share of the robbery was $500,000, more money than he had made from his drug operations in the previous 2 years. But more importantly, the success of the Lufthansa heist raised his status within the organized crime community to a whole new level. He was no longer just a successful member of Paul Vario's crew. He was now recognized as one of the most skilled and reliable criminals in New York. The months following the Lufthansa heist were the high point of Henry Hill's criminal career. He had more money than he had ever imagined possible, complete respect from his criminal associates, and a lifestyle that went beyond his wildest childhood fantasies. Henry and Karen moved to a larger house in an even more exclusive neighborhood, where their new wealth allowed them to fit in smoothly with legal millionaires and business executives. They drove expensive cars, wore designer clothes, and ate at restaurants where a single meal cost more than most people's weekly salary. But the real pleasure for Henry wasn't the material things. It was the power and respect that came with financial success. He could walk into any restaurant in the city and get the best table, the finest service, and the complete attention of the staff. He could solve problems with phone calls, help friends with business opportunities, and command the kind of respect that he had admired in older wise guys when he was a teenager. The crew's regular get-togethers at the Bamboo Lounge became celebrations of their success. They would spend whole evenings eating, drinking, and telling stories about their various criminal operations. The money from Lufthansa had allowed everyone to expand their businesses, take on more ambitious projects, and live at a level of luxury that seemed almost unreal. Tommy DeSimone bought a new car every month, not because he needed transportation, but because he enjoyed the process of walking into a dealership and paying cash for the most expensive vehicle on the lot. Jimmy Burke invested his share in legal businesses, building a collection of restaurants and construction companies that gave cover for the crew's continuing criminal activities. Paul Vario, always the leader, used his portion of the Lufthansa money to strengthen the crew's position within the larger Lucchese family structure. He made smart investments in political connections, influence with judges, and law enforcement relationships that would protect the crew's operations for years to come. For Henry, the months after Lufthansa represented everything he had dreamed of since childhood. He was living like the wise guys he had admired from his bedroom window, with the added advantage of being young enough to enjoy his success for decades to come. The future seemed unlimited, full of possibilities that went far beyond the narrow streets of East New York. But success in the criminal world carries its own unique dangers, and the very size of the Lufthansa score was about to create problems that none of them had expected. The first sign of trouble came not from law enforcement, but from within the crew itself. The huge success of the Lufthansa heist had created a situation that experienced criminals understand, but rarely talk about openly. When there's too much money involved, friends become enemies and paranoia becomes a survival skill. The problem was simple but deadly. $6 million represented more money than most members of the crew had ever seen, certainly more than they had ever possessed at one time. For men who had spent their whole lives operating on the edge of poverty, this sudden wealth was both exciting and frightening. More importantly, the money had made everyone involved in the robbery a possible threat to everyone else. Each member of the crew knew enough about the others to send them all to prison for the rest of their lives. In the days right after the robbery, this shared danger had been a source of strength. They were all equally committed to staying silent about their activities. But as weeks turned into months and the first excitement of success began to fade, the math of mutual destruction started to work against them. If one person decided to cooperate with law enforcement, they could possibly reduce their own sentence while making sure that their former associates got the maximum punishment. The temptation to be the first to talk, and therefore the first to make a deal, was huge. Jimmy Burke, with his decades of experience in high-stakes criminal operations, was the first to see the danger. He had seen successful crews destroy themselves through paranoia and betrayal, and he was determined not to let that happen to his organization. His solution was, as always, direct. Remove the possible threats before they could become actual threats. If someone seemed likely to cooperate with law enforcement, they would disappear before they had the chance. If someone was spending their Lufthansa money too openly, they would be warned once and then killed if they didn't change their behavior. Henry at first thought Jimmy's worries were too extreme. The crew had worked together successfully for years through dozens of smaller scores and countless small crises. Their loyalty to each other had been tested and proven many times over. Why would the Lufthansa money change that basic dynamic? But as the months passed, Henry began to see the signs that Jimmy had recognized right away. Conversations that had once been open and trusting became guarded and suspicious. Men who had been like brothers started watching each other for signs of weakness or disloyalty. The easy friendship that had characterized the crew's relationships was replaced by a careful politeness that hid growing distrust. The first death came in February 1979, just 2 months after the Lufthansa heist. Parnell Stax Edwards, a small-time criminal who had driven one of the getaway cars, was found shot to death in his apartment. The official police investigation concluded that he had been killed during a robbery. But everyone connected to the Lufthansa job understood the real message. People who knew too much were becoming unnecessary. Stax had made the mistake of being too visible with his share of the robbery money. He had bought expensive jewelry, a new car, and had been seen in nightclubs spending money like a man who had recently come into a fortune. More troubling, he had been heard talking about the Lufthansa job with people who hadn't been directly involved. Jimmy Burke had warned him twice about his behavior. The third warning came in the form of 2 bullets to the head. Henry attended Stax Edwards's funeral, along with several other members of the crew. They stood in the back of the church dressed in their best suits, paying their respects to a man they had all liked and worked with for years. But they also understood that they were watching a demonstration of what happened to crew members who couldn't follow simple instructions about keeping quiet. The second death came in May 1979. Louis Cafara, who had been one of the gunmen during the robbery, disappeared along with his wife while returning from a vacation in Florida. Their bodies were never found, but everyone understood what had happened. Cafara had been talking about leaving New York and starting a new life somewhere else. Conversation that suggested he might be getting ready to cooperate with federal investigators. By the summer of 1979, fear had replaced celebration as the main feeling among the Lufthansa crew. Men who had once met regularly for dinner and drinks started avoiding each other, afraid that any gathering might be seen as a conspiracy. Phone calls that had once been routine became exercises in careful coded speaking, with every word examined for possible hidden meanings. Henry found himself caught between his loyalty to the crew and his growing understanding that his own survival might depend on getting out of the criminal life entirely. But leaving wasn't a realistic option. He knew too much, had earned too much, and was too valuable to the organization to simply walk away. Of all the deaths that followed the Lufthansa heist, none affected Henry more deeply than the disappearance of Tommy DeSimone in January 1979. Tommy had been Henry's closest friend within the crew, the man who had taught him about style, violence, and the complicated psychology of criminal success. Tommy's problem wasn't that he had been careless with money or talked too much about the robbery. His problem was far more serious. He had killed a maid member of another family without permission from his bosses. The victim was Billy Batts, a soldier in the Gambino family who had recently been released from prison and had made the mistake of publicly insulting Tommy in front of other wise guys. The insult itself was relatively minor. Billy Batts had called Tommy a kid and suggested that he hadn't earned his reputation through his own efforts. But Tommy's response was, as always, extreme. He beat Billy Batts to death with a baseball bat, then buried the body in a place that was never found. Under normal circumstances, Tommy's crime might have been overlooked or resolved through negotiation between the families. Billy Batts wasn't particularly important, and Tommy was a valuable earner for the Lucchese organization. But the attention that the Lufthansa heist had brought to Paul Vario's crew made it impossible to ignore such a clear violation of rules between families. The Gambino family demanded justice, and Paul Vario was in no position to refuse their request. Tommy was called to a meeting where he expected to be formally accepted into the Lucchese family as a made member, the honor he had dreamed of his whole criminal career. Instead, he was shot to death the moment he walked into the room. Henry learned about Tommy's death through Paul Vario, who delivered the news with a kind of matter-of-fact tone that wise guys used to talk about the weather. "Tommy's gone," Paul said simply. "He made a mistake, and he paid for it. That's the end of the discussion." But for Henry, it wasn't the end of anything. Tommy's death represented the destruction of everything he had believed about loyalty, friendship, and the code that supposedly ruled their world. If Tommy DeSimone, a made member, a legendary earner, a man who had killed for the family dozens of times, could be killed for a single mistake, then no one was safe. The paranoia that had been growing in Henry's mind since the Lufthansa heist now exploded into full-blown terror. Every phone call could be a setup, every meeting could be an execution. Every friend could be an enemy waiting for the right moment to strike. As the fear and paranoia took over more of Henry's emotional energy, his drug operations began to suffer. The careful attention to detail that had made him successful was replaced by increasingly unpredictable behavior and poor decisions. He started using cocaine regularly, not just for fun, but as a way to handle the anxiety that now ruled his daily life. The cocaine use created a vicious cycle that sped up his downward slide. The drug gave him the confidence and energy to continue running his business. But it also hurt his judgment and made him paranoid about imaginary threats while ignoring real dangers. Karen began to notice the changes in her husband's behavior. He was staying out later, sleeping less, and showing a nervousness that seemed to increase rather than decrease over time. Their conversations became strained, filled with Henry's unclear answers to Karen's increasingly direct questions about his work and his associates. The quality of Henry's drug product began to get worse as he cut corners to maximize profits and minimize his exposure to risk. His customer base, which had once been made up mostly of wealthy suburbanites looking for high-quality cocaine, was replaced by more desperate users who were willing to accept lower-quality drugs at lower prices. More dangerously, Henry began working with suppliers and distributors who lacked the carefulness and professionalism that had marked his earlier operations. These new associates were more likely to attract police attention, more likely to get arrested, and much more likely to cooperate with law enforcement if they were caught. By 1980, Henry's drug business had become exactly the kind of operation that experienced wise guys avoided: high-profile, poorly organized, and filled with people who couldn't be trusted to stay silent if they were arrested. The morning of May 11th, 1980, started like any other day in Henry Hill's increasingly chaotic life. He had been up most of the night coordinating a drug delivery, had managed only a few hours of cocaine-fueled sleep, and was planning to spend the day dealing with the various crises that seemed to multiply faster than he could solve them. But this day would be different. This would be the day that everything he had built over the previous 25 years would come crashing down in a matter of minutes. The first sign of trouble came at 6:30 a.m. when Henry noticed an unusual number of cars parked on his street. In his paranoid state, he had become extremely sensitive to anything that seemed out of place in his suburban neighborhood. But these cars contained federal agents, not killers, though the ultimate threat they represented was just as serious. Henry was in his kitchen drinking coffee and planning his day when the front door exploded inward and a team of D agents flooded into his house. Karen screamed, their children began crying, and Henry's first thought was not about arrest or prosecution, but about whether the crew would assume he had been cooperating with law enforcement. The agents had warrants to search the house and arrest Henry on federal drug trafficking charges. They had been investigating his operations for months, building a case based on surveillance, wiretaps, and information provided by several of his associates who had already been arrested and had chosen to cooperate rather than face decades in federal prison. As Henry was handcuffed and read his rights, he could see the entire foundation of his life crumbling around him. The house that represented his success, the family that represented his respectability, the business that represented his future, All of it was now evidence in a federal criminal case that could result in a life sentence. But the arrest was only the beginning of Henry's problems. The real crisis would come when he was forced to choose between loyalty to the crew that had been his family for 25 years and survival for himself, his wife, and his children. The months following the Lufthansa heist should have been the happiest of Henry Hill's life. He had more money than he had ever dreamed possible, respect from the most dangerous men in New York, and a lifestyle that went beyond every fantasy he had entertained as a poor kid watching wise guys from his bedroom window. But success in the criminal world operates by different rules than success in honest activities. In the straight world, achievement generally makes you safer, wealthier, more connected, better protected by social institutions and legal safeguards. In the world Henry lived in, success often made you more vulnerable, more visible, and more likely to become a target for elimination by the very people who had helped you achieve that success. The $6 million Lufthansa score had made everyone involved wealthy, but it had also made them dangerous to each other. Each member of the robbery crew possessed enough information to destroy all the others. In the days right after the heist, this shared weakness had created a sense of unity and common purpose. But as time passed and the first excitement faded, that same weakness began to feel more like a loaded gun pointed at each man's head. Henry began to understand a basic truth about high-stakes criminal operations. The bigger the score, the more dangerous the aftermath. Small robberies might result in arrest and a few years in prison, but major crimes like Lufthansa carried the possibility of life sentences, which meant that every person involved had strong reasons to cooperate with law enforcement if they were caught. The math was simple but terrifying. If you stayed loyal and kept quiet, you faced decades in federal prison. If you decided to cooperate and give information about your associates, you might be able to get a much lighter sentence. The first person to make a deal would get the best offer. The last person to cooperate would have nothing to trade. This situation created a prisoner's dilemma on a huge scale. Everyone's best individual strategy was to be the first to cooperate, but everyone's shared interest lay in staying silent. The tension between these competing reasons was slowly tearing the crew apart. Jimmy Burke had been in the criminal business long enough to recognize the warning signs. He had seen successful crews destroy themselves through paranoia and betrayal, and he was determined not to let that happen to his organization. His solution was, as always, direct and brutal. Remove possible threats before they could become actual threats. Jimmy's thinking was coldly practical. If someone seemed likely to cooperate with law enforcement, they represented a deadly danger to everyone else in the crew. Better to kill that person and remove the threat entirely than to wait and hope they would stay loyal under pressure. The problem was that this solution created its own escalating cycle of violence and paranoia. Once Jimmy started killing people who might cooperate, everyone else in the crew had to worry about whether their own behavior might be seen as possibly disloyal. A casual comment, an unusual absence, a small change in routine. Any of these could be seen as proof that someone was getting ready to betray the group. Henry watched in horror as men who had been his friends for years began to disappear. Some were shot, others simply vanished without explanation, and a few died in what appeared to be accidents, but which everyone understood were carefully planned murders. The crew's regular get-togethers at the Bamboo Lounge became exercises in careful acting, with everyone trying to appear completely loyal while simultaneously watching their associates for signs of disloyalty. Conversations that had once been natural and easy became stiff and fake, filled with coded references and careful omissions. Henry began to realize that his own position in the crew was becoming increasingly uncertain. His drug operations, which had once been seen as a valuable source of income, were now viewed as a possible problem. Drug dealers were known to be very likely to cooperate with law enforcement, and Henry's cocaine use was making him seem increasingly unstable and unpredictable. As the paranoia within the crew grew stronger, Henry found himself becoming increasingly isolated from the men who had been his substitute family for over 2 decades. Jimmy Burke, who had once treated Henry like a younger brother, became distant and suspicious. Paul Vario, who had served as a father figure throughout Henry's criminal career, began treating him with the kind of careful politeness reserved for possible enemies. The isolation was especially damaging because Henry had never built strong relationships outside the criminal world. His marriage to Karen was loving, but complicated by the secrets he had to keep about his work. His relationships with legal neighbors and acquaintances were shallow, designed to maintain his cover rather than provide real friendship and support. Within the crew, Henry had always been somewhat of an outsider because of his mixed background, but his skills and ability to earn money had made him a valued member of the team. Now, as suspicion and fear replaced trust and friendship, his status as a non-Italian became an extra problem. He wasn't protected by the same codes and traditions that might protect full-blooded members from accusations or violence. Henry began to spend more and more time alone, using cocaine to handle his anxiety while trying to figure out how to navigate the increasingly dangerous dynamics within the crew. He knew that any sign of weakness or disloyalty could result in his death, but he also knew that continuing to associate with men who no longer trusted him was equally dangerous. The drug use, which had started as a fun extra, became a necessity for managing the mental pressure of his situation. Cocaine gave temporary relief from the paranoia and fear that had become his constant companions. But it also hurt his judgment and made him more likely to make the kinds of mistakes that could be deadly in his current situation. Throughout Henry's criminal career, Karen had kept a kind of intentional ignorance about the details of her husband's work. She knew that he wasn't a regular businessman, but she had chosen not to ask too many questions about activities that might have uncomfortable answers. But by 1979, the changes in Henry's behavior had become too big to ignore. He was staying out until dawn, sleeping poorly during the day, and showing a level of nervousness and paranoia that seemed to increase rather than decrease over time. Their conversations became increasingly strained, with Henry giving unclear answers to even simple questions about his daily activities. More troubling were the phone calls. Henry would get calls at all hours of the day and night, and his responses suggested that he was dealing with serious problems that went beyond ordinary business difficulties. Karen began to overhear pieces of conversations about people who had gone away or wouldn't be a problem anymore. Language that suggested something far more sinister than regular business disputes. The money side of their life also became more unpredictable. Henry would sometimes come home with huge amounts of cash, enough to pay household expenses for months in advance. But at other times, he seemed genuinely worried about money, making comments about needing to take care of some things before they could make big purchases or plan expensive vacations. Karen's attempts to discuss these concerns with Henry were met with reassurances that became increasingly unconvincing. He would promise that everything was fine, that the problems he was dealing with were temporary, and that their life would return to normal soon. But his behavior suggested that he was dealing with pressures and dangers that were far from temporary. The most frightening part of Henry's changing behavior was his increasing use of cocaine. Karen had been aware that Henry occasionally used drugs for fun, but by 1979, his cocaine use had become regular and heavy enough to affect his personality and judgment. He would stay awake for days at a time, become upset over small issues, and show a level of paranoia that seemed completely disconnected from reality. Unknown to Henry and the other members of the crew, federal law enforcement had been building a case against them since shortly after the Lufthansa heist. The huge size of the robbery had guaranteed that it would receive special attention from the FBI, and the Bureau had put together a task force dedicated to identifying and prosecuting everyone involved. The investigation had begun with physical evidence from the crime scene, but had quickly grown to include watching known associates of Jimmy Burke and Paul Vario. Federal agents had identified most of the robbery participants within months of the heist and had begun the slow process of building cases they could take to court against each of them. The breakthrough came when several members of the crew were arrested on unrelated charges and decided to cooperate with federal investigators, rather than face long prison sentences. These cooperators gave detailed information about not just the Lufthansa heist, but about the crew's whole criminal operation covering decades. Henry's drug operations made him a particularly attractive target for federal prosecutors. Drug trafficking charges carried severe required sentences, and drug dealers were, statistically, more likely to cooperate with law enforcement than traditional organized crime figures. If federal agents could arrest Henry on drug charges, they might be able to convince him to give information about more important crimes, including the Lufthansa heist. The federal investigation into Henry's drug activities began in late 1979 with agents watching his operations and trying to get into his distribution network. They identified his suppliers, his customers, and his methods of operation. More importantly, they began recording a pattern of criminal activity that would support charges under federal racketeering laws. By early 1980, federal prosecutors had enough evidence to get arrest warrants for Henry and several of his associates. They were simply waiting for the right moment to act, a moment that would maximize their chances of convincing Henry to cooperate against higher-level members of the organization. Henry's cocaine use, which had begun as a way to manage the stress and paranoia of his situation, quickly became another source of problems that threatened to destroy everything he had worked to build. What had started as occasional fun use grew into daily consumption, then into the kind of heavy, compulsive use that affected every part of his life. The drug changed Henry's personality in ways that made him dangerous to himself and to everyone around him. The confidence and smooth social skills that had made him successful in both criminal and legal settings were replaced by unpredictable behavior and poor judgment. He became suspicious of people who had never given him reason for suspicion, while simultaneously trusting people who were obviously unreliable. His business operations suffered as a result. The careful attention to detail that had marked his earlier criminal activities was replaced by increasingly sloppy procedures and poor security practices. He began working with suppliers and customers who lacked the carefulness and professionalism that had protected him for years. More dangerously, Henry's cocaine use was making him visible to law enforcement in ways that his previous activities had not. Drug users and dealers attracted attention from local police, federal agents, and other criminals who saw drug operations as easy targets for robbery and extortion. Karen watched her husband's decline with a mix of fear and frustration. The man she had married, confident, successful, and completely in control of his environment, was being replaced by someone she barely recognized. Henry's cocaine use was destroying not just his criminal career, but his ability to function as a husband and father. The irony was that Henry's drug use was probably the only thing that made it possible for him to continue functioning at all. The paranoia and fear that had become his constant companions were so overwhelming that only cocaine gave temporary relief. But that relief came at the cost of making him even more vulnerable to the dangers that had created his paranoia in the first place. By the spring of 1980, Henry Hill's criminal career was reaching its unavoidable end. The combination of federal investigation, crew paranoia, and his own drug-fueled decline had created a situation that could only end in death or arrest. Henry knew that his time was running out, but he was trapped by circumstances that offered no good options. If he tried to separate himself from the crew, he would be seen as a possible informant and marked for death. If he continued his association with men who no longer trusted him, he would eventually be killed as a safety measure. If he tried to run away, he would be hunted by both law enforcement and his former associates. The drug business that had once given him huge profits and a feeling of independence had become a source of constant danger. His customers were unreliable, his suppliers were under federal surveillance, and his distribution network was filled with people who would cooperate with law enforcement at the first sign of pressure. Most troubling of all, Henry was beginning to understand that the crew he had considered his family was getting ready to kill him. Jimmy Burke, who had once been like an older brother, was now treating him with the kind of careful hostility that came before violence. Paul Vario, who had served as his substitute father, was distancing himself in ways that suggested Henry was being written off as an acceptable loss. The signs were subtle but impossible to miss for someone who had spent 25 years learning to read the moods and intentions of dangerous men. Conversations ended when Henry entered a room. Phone calls were made and whispered discussions that stopped when he came near. Plans were made for activities that didn't include him. Despite his previous involvement in similar operations, Henry realized that he was probably going to be killed. But he also realized that he was too far gone on cocaine to think clearly about how to protect himself. The drug that had helped him manage his paranoia was now making him unable to respond logically to real threats. In the early morning hours of May 11th, 1980, as Henry Hill sat in a federal holding cell thinking about charges that could result in a life sentence, he faced the hardest decision of his adult life. Everything he had believed about loyalty, honor, and the code that ruled his world was about to be tested in the most basic way possible. For 25 years, Henry had lived by a simple rule: you never cooperated with law enforcement. No matter what the personal results, this wasn't just a practical rule designed to protect criminal operations. It was a moral foundation that defined what it meant to be a wise guy. Men who broke this rule weren't just criminals who had made bad decisions. They were something worse than criminals. They were rats, informants, the lowest form of life in the criminal world. But Henry also understood that the crew he had considered his family was getting ready to kill him. The loyalty that he had shown for over 2 decades would not be returned. The men who had taught him about honor and brotherhood were planning his murder as a simple matter of self-protection. Federal prosecutors made their offer clear and direct: cooperate fully in their investigation of the Lufthansa heist and related criminal activities, and Henry could expect to serve maybe 5 to 10 years in federal prison. Refuse to cooperate, and he would almost certainly be found guilty of drug trafficking charges that carried a required life sentence. But the choice wasn't really between cooperation and prison. The choice was between cooperation and death. If Henry refused to cooperate and somehow managed to get out on bail, he would be killed within days of his release. Jimmy Burke and Paul Vario couldn't afford to let him stay free with the knowledge he had about their criminal activities. Federal agents handling Henry's case understood his situation perfectly. They had seen it dozens of times before. Successful criminals who reached a point where their former associates became more dangerous than law enforcement. The agents knew that Henry's decision would ultimately be based not on abstract ideas about loyalty and honor, but on the simple desire to stay alive. As Henry sat in his cell, weighing options that all seemed to lead to different forms of destruction, he thought about Karen and their children. What kind of father allowed himself to be murdered for the sake of staying loyal to men who were planning to kill him? What kind of husband chose abstract ideas over the real responsibility of staying alive to protect his family? The decision, when it finally came, was both unavoidable and devastating. Henry Hill would become what he had been taught to hate: an informant, a cooperator, a rat. He would trade everything he had been for the possibility of staying alive to see his children grow up. It was, he would later think, the only logical choice available to him. But logic gave no comfort for the knowledge that he was about to betray men who had been like family to him for most of his adult life. The moment Henry Hill decided to cooperate with federal authorities, he crossed a line from which there could never be any return. In the small interrogation room at the Brooklyn Federal Courthouse, surrounded by FBI agents and federal prosecutors, Henry made the choice that would save his life and destroy his identity. "I'll tell you everything," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the hum of the air conditioning. "But I want guarantees about my family's safety." Federal prosecutor Edward McDonald, who had been handling organized crime cases for over a decade, recognized the importance of what was happening. Henry Hill wasn't just another small-time criminal looking to reduce his sentence. He was a high-level member of one of the most successful crews in the Lucchese crime family, with detailed knowledge about criminal activities covering more than 2 decades. The information Henry had could possibly destroy an entire criminal organization. He knew about the Lufthansa heist, the largest cash robbery in American history. He knew about dozens of other robberies, murders, and criminal operations. Most importantly, he could give testimony that would be devastating to Jimmy Burke, Paul Vario, and other high-ranking members of the organization. But cooperation would come at a price that went far beyond the immediate legal results. Henry would have to spend the rest of his life in hiding with a new identity and the constant knowledge that former friends were actively trying to kill him. His children would grow up with different names in different cities, never able to contact their grandparents or childhood friends. Karen Hill, who had been arrested along with her husband, faced her own impossible choice. She could stay loyal to Henry and enter the witness protection program with him, or she could divorce him and try to rebuild her life on her own. Either choice meant the end of the life she had known and loved. "We understand the sacrifice you're making," MacDonald told Henry, "but you need to understand that once you start this process, there's no going back. You'll be testifying against men who will want to kill you for the rest of your life." Henry nodded, already understanding that his old life was over no matter what choice he made. If he didn't cooperate, he would spend his life in federal prison or be murdered by his former associates. If he did cooperate, he would spend his life in hiding, protected by the federal government, but forever cut off from everything he had known. The FBI questioning process took months, with Henry spending countless hours in secure places, telling every detail of his criminal career. Federal agents were particularly interested in the Lufthansa heist, but they also wanted complete information about the crew's other activities: robberies, murders, loan sharking operations, drug trafficking, and connections to legal businesses. Henry's memory was remarkably detailed, helped by his natural intelligence and his understanding of how criminal organizations operated. He could describe not just the crimes themselves, but the planning process, the division of money, and the relationships between different members of the crew and other criminal organizations. The information Henry gave went beyond the FBI's most hopeful expectations. He could connect dozens of people to serious federal crimes, give evidence about unsolved murders dating back decades, and explain the organization and operating methods of one of the most successful crime families in the country. But the questioning process was also emotionally devastating for Henry. Each session required him to live again through events that had defined his adult life, while simultaneously betraying men who had been like family to him. The agents asking the questions were professional and respectful, but they were also representatives of the law enforcement system that Henry had been taught to see as the enemy. Karen took part in some of the questioning sessions, giving information about the wives and families of crew members, the legal businesses that served as covers for criminal activities, and the social networks that connected the criminal world to respectable society. Her cooperation was especially valuable because wives often knew details about their husbands' activities that the men themselves might forget or downplay. The federal agents handling the case understood that they were asking Henry and Karen to give up everything they had known for the sake of justice. But they also understood that the Hills' cooperation represented the best chance to prosecute some of the most dangerous criminals in New York. Before entering the witness protection program, Henry was allowed a short time to settle his affairs and prepare for a life in hiding. This process was both practical and deeply emotional, as he had to cut ties with every person in place that had given his life meaning. The hardest part was explaining to his children that their lives were about to change completely. Ruth and Joseph Hill, who had grown up in comfortable suburban wealth, would have to take new names and move to a place where no one knew their family history. They wouldn't be able to contact their friends, their schools, or their grandparents ever again. Henry also had to make money arrangements that would allow his family to survive without access to the criminal income that had supported their lifestyle. The federal government gave some financial support for families and witness protection, but it was a tiny part of what Henry had been earning through his criminal activities. Most painfully, Henry had to accept that he would never again see most of the people who had been important to him. His mother, his siblings, his childhood friends. All of them would have to believe that Henry Hill had simply disappeared, probably killed by his criminal associates. The mental impact of this complete cutting of connections was devastating. Henry was losing not just his criminal career, but his whole identity, everything that had defined him as a person. His relationships, his reputation, his feeling of belonging to something larger than himself, was being stripped away in preparation for a life as someone else entirely. Karen struggled with similar losses, made worse by her anger at Henry for creating the circumstances that had destroyed their family's life. She had known that Henry's work was dangerous, but she hadn't fully understood that his choices could result in the complete destruction of everything they had built together. The Witness Protection Program moved the Hill family to Nebraska, where they were given new identities and a modest house in a middle-class neighborhood. Henry Hill became Martin Lewis, a former restaurant manager looking for work in the hospitality industry. Karen became Linda Lewis, a suburban housewife trying to adjust to life in a state she had never wanted to visit. The change was difficult in ways that none of them had expected. Henry, who had been used to respect, honor, and quick satisfaction of his desires, now had to live as an ordinary citizen in a community where no one knew or cared about his previous accomplishments. He had to find legal work, follow normal social rules, and interact with people who had no understanding of the world he had come from. Karen struggled with the isolation and the loss of the wealthy lifestyle she had enjoyed in New York. The house in Nebraska was comfortable but modest, The social opportunities were limited, and the constant fear of being discovered made it difficult to form real friendships with their new neighbors. The children adapted more easily, but they also paid a big mental price for their father's choices. They had to make up new personal histories, avoid references to their previous lives, and live with the knowledge that their safety depended on keeping up a complicated web of lies about their family's background. Henry found legal work as a restaurant manager, but the move from criminal success to regular employment was mentally devastating. He was used to making decisions, commanding respect, and earning a lot of money. Now he was taking orders from people he considered less intelligent and less important than himself, while earning a tiny part of his previous income. The boredom and lack of purpose that marked Henry's new life led to problems with alcohol and depression. He had spent his adult life in a world where every day brought new challenges, new opportunities, and new risks. The predictable routine of legal employment felt like a kind of death sentence. Henry's cooperation with federal authorities resulted in multiple trials covering several years. He testified against Jimmy Burke, Paul Vario, and many other members of the organization, giving detailed accounts of criminal activities that prosecutors had been trying to prove for decades. The trials were emotionally difficult for Henry, as he had to face men who had been like family to him, while testifying about their most private criminal secrets. The courtroom confrontations were filled with tension as Henry's former associates stared at him with a mix of hatred and disbelief. Jimmy Burke, sitting at the defendant's table in an expensive suit, looked at Henry with a kind of cold fury that had once been saved for their enemies. The man who had taught Henry about planning complex crimes, who had shared countless meals and celebrations with him, now saw him as the ultimate betrayer, Paul Vario, the father figure who had guided Henry's criminal education for over 2 decades. Refused to look at him directly during the testimony. The old man's disappointment was somehow more painful than Jimmy's anger. Paul had invested years in Henry's growth, had trusted him with the most sensitive family business, and had protected him when others questioned his loyalty. But Henry's testimony was devastating and complete. He could describe not just the general outlines of their criminal activities, but specific details that only someone with close knowledge could give. He knew who had planned each robbery, who had taken part in each murder, and how the money had been divided. Most importantly, he could explain the organization and operating methods that had made the crew so successful for so many years. Prosecutors were particularly interested in the Lufthansa heist, and Henry gave a complete account of the planning, execution, and aftermath of the robbery. His testimony connected Jimmy Burke directly to the crime, described the roles played by each participant, and explained how the huge amount of money had been divided and cleaned. Henry also testified about many murders, including the planned killing of Lufthansa participants who had been seen as security risks. His accounts were detailed and specific, giving prosecutors evidence about crimes they had been investigating for years without success. Henry's testimony resulted in convictions that effectively destroyed the criminal organization he had once belonged to. Jimmy Burke was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, found guilty not just of the Lufthansa heist, but of multiple murders and racketeering charges. Paul Vario, despite his age and failing health, was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison on racketeering charges. The conviction effectively ended his long career as one of the most successful crew leaders in the Lucchese crime family. Dozens of other members and associates were found guilty on various charges from robbery and murder to tax evasion and money laundering. The careful prosecution took apart an organization that had operated successfully for over 3 decades. But the convictions came at a huge personal cost to Henry. Each successful prosecution strengthened his status as the ultimate informant. The man who had destroyed an entire criminal family for the sake of his own survival. Within the larger organized crime community, Henry Hill became a symbol of everything that was wrong with the new generation of criminals. Men who would give up honor and loyalty for personal advantage. The convictions also failed to give Henry a feeling of justice or closure that he had hoped for. Instead of feeling proven right by the destruction of men who had planned to kill him, Henry felt empty and without purpose. The trials had required him to live through the most important period of his life while simultaneously rejecting everything he had once believed about loyalty and brotherhood. The Federal Witness Protection Program was designed to give safety and anonymity for cooperating witnesses. But it wasn't designed to handle someone with Henry Hill's mental profile and personal history. Henry had spent his adult life as a successful criminal, used to respect, excitement, and a lot of money. The program's expectation that he would adjust to life as an ordinary citizen proved to be too hopeful. Problems in witness protection began almost immediately. He had difficulty finding and keeping legal work, partly because of his lack of normal job skills and partly because of his inability to accept the authority and routine that most jobs required. More seriously, Henry began drinking heavily and using drugs, partly to deal with depression and partly out of boredom with his new life. The alcohol and drug use made him unpredictable and possibly dangerous to the safety of his family's new identities. Henry also had difficulty keeping the secrecy that was essential to the program's success. He would tell stories about his previous life to bartenders, co-workers, and casual acquaintances, usually while drunk. These breaks in security put his family at risk and required regular moves to new cities with new identities. Corinne struggled with her own adjustment to witness protection, but her problems were different from Henry's. She was angry about the loss of their previous lifestyle, bitter about Henry's choices that had led to their current situation, and frustrated by the limits that witness protection placed on their family's future. The children adapted better than their parents, but they also paid a big mental price for the constant moves, identity changes, and social isolation that marked their teenage years. They couldn't form lasting friendships, take part in school activities that might attract attention, or develop the kind of stable social connections that most teenagers take for granted. After several failed attempts at other careers, Henry eventually found work in the restaurant industry, where his knowledge of food and customer service allowed him to reach some level of professional success. He worked as a manager in various places, slowly building a reputation as someone who understood both the operational and financial sides of the restaurant business. The restaurant work gave Henry something he had been missing since entering witness protection, a feeling of ability and professional achievement. He was good at managing restaurants, able to motivate staff, control costs, and create the kind of dining experience that brought repeat customers. More importantly, the restaurant business gave Henry an outlet for skills he had developed during his criminal career. The ability to read people, to manage complicated relationships, and to solve problems quickly were all valuable in legal business settings. Henry eventually opened his own restaurant, a small Italian place that specialized in the kind of real food he had learned to enjoy during his years with the crew. The restaurant was successful, both financially and personally satisfying, in ways that Henry hadn't expected. For the first time since entering witness protection, Henry felt like he was building something positive rather than just surviving. The restaurant gave him a reason to get up in the morning, a source of pride in his work, and a way to contribute to his community that didn't involve breaking the law. But the restaurant years also showed the permanent changes in Henry's personality and worldview. He could never completely trust his employees, his business partners, or even his customers. The paranoia and suspicion that had kept him alive in the criminal world never entirely disappeared, even in the relatively safe environment of legal business. Despite his cooperation with federal authorities and his attempts to build a legal life, Henry continued to have problems with law enforcement throughout the 1980s and 1990s. These problems were usually related to drug use, alcohol abuse, or relatively minor violations that showed his difficulty adjusting to normal social expectations. Henry was arrested several times for drug possession, usually in connection with cocaine or prescription drugs that he was using to treat his depression and anxiety. These arrests were embarrassing and possibly dangerous, as they attracted the kind of attention that could compromise his safety and witness protection. He also had problems with tax authorities, partly because his move from criminal income to legal earnings had left him without the money, management skills needed for legal compliance. The IRS went after him for unpaid taxes from his restaurant businesses, creating extra stress and money pressure. These legal problems were relatively minor compared to the federal charges that had originally led to his cooperation, but they showed Henry's ongoing struggle to adjust to life outside the criminal world. He had learned to succeed in an environment where rules were flexible and relationships were based on mutual benefit rather than legal duty. The change to a world ruled by bureaucratic procedures and following rules was never completely successful. Karen, who had divorced Henry during their time in witness protection, watched his continuing problems with a mix of sympathy and frustration. She understood the difficulties he faced in adjusting to legal life, but she also blamed his choices for the destruction of their family's previous existence. In the late 1980s, Henry's story attracted the attention of Nicholas Pileggi, a journalist who specialized in organized crime stories. Pileggi recognized that Henry's experiences gave a unique window into the world of professional criminals, offering insights that were rarely available to outsiders. The resulting book, Wise Guy, was published in 1985 and became a bestseller. Pileggi's account of Henry's life was detailed and compelling, capturing both the tempting appeal of criminal success and the ultimate cost of choosing that path. The book's success led to Martin Scorsese's 1990 film Goodfellas, which brought Henry's story to an even larger audience. The film was both praised by critics and commercially successful, establishing Henry Hill as one of the most famous former criminals in American popular culture. The public recognition was a mixed blessing for Henry. On one hand, the book and film gave him some income and a form of validation for his decision to cooperate with authorities. On the other hand, the publicity made it more difficult for him to keep the anonymity that was supposed to protect him from revenge. Henry began making public appearances, giving interviews about his experiences, and taking part in documentaries about organized crime. These appearances were financially rewarding and personally satisfying, as they allowed him to tell his story from his own point of view, rather than through the filter of law enforcement or media interpretation. But the publicity also increased the danger to Henry's safety. Former associates who might have forgotten about him were reminded of his existence and his cooperation. The specific details revealed in the book and film made it easier for people to identify him despite his supposed protection under the witness program. In the later years of his life, Henry found an unexpected outlet for his talents and experiences through cooking shows and celebrity appearances. His knowledge of Italian-American food, combined with his colorful personality and famous story, made him an entertaining television guest and cooking teacher. Henry appeared on various food programs, showing the recipes he had learned during his years around restaurants and social clubs in Brooklyn and Queens. He had a natural ability to tell stories while cooking, mixing stories about food with carefully edited accounts of his criminal experiences. The cooking shows gave Henry a form of legal fame that he found deeply satisfying. He was being recognized and rewarded for skills and knowledge that had nothing to do with his criminal past. Even though that past had given him access to the experiences that made his cooking expertise real and interesting, Henry also wrote a cookbook that mixed recipes with stories about his life. Both criminal and legal, the book was moderately successful, appealing to readers who were interested in both cooking and true crime stories. These later career developments gave Henry a feeling of success and purpose that had been missing from his life. Since entering witness protection, he was contributing something positive to popular culture, sharing knowledge and experiences in ways that entertained and taught rather than harmed others. But the fame also kept him connected to his criminal past in ways that made complete change impossible. He would always be known mainly as a former gangster who had betrayed his associates, rather than as someone who had successfully moved to legal life. As Henry Hill entered his final years, he spent a lot of time thinking about the choices he had made and the life he had lived. The perspective of age and experience allowed him to see patterns and results that hadn't been clear during the intense years of criminal activity and later cooperation with law enforcement. Henry understood that his decision to enter the criminal world as a teenager had set in motion a series of events that had ultimately destroyed everything he had tried to build. The money, respect, and excitement that had attracted him to the wise guy lifestyle had come at a cost that went far beyond his own life, to include his family, his friends, and even his former criminal associates. But Henry also understood that his decision to cooperate with federal authorities, while necessary for his survival, had required him to break rules that had once defined his identity. The code of silence and loyalty that ruled the criminal world wasn't just a practical rule. It was a moral structure that gave meaning and order to an otherwise chaotic and violent existence. The cooperation had saved his life and allowed him to see his children grow to adulthood, but it had also marked him permanently as someone who couldn't be trusted to stay loyal under pressure. This reputation followed him through witness protection, through his legal business efforts, and through his later celebrity appearances. Henry often wondered whether there had been other paths he might have taken at important moments in his life. Could he have refused to enter the criminal world as a teenager? Could he have gotten himself out of criminal activities before they became so serious that cooperation with law enforcement was his only option for survival? These questions had no good answers, but they showed Henry's growing understanding that criminal success, no matter how amazing, ultimately led to results that no logical person would choose if they fully understood the outcomes. Henry Hill's later years were marked by declining health, continued money struggles, and a growing feeling of separation from both his criminal past and his legal present. He had reached a form of fame that gave some income and recognition, but he had never been able to build the kind of stable, satisfying life that most people take for granted. His relationships with his children were complicated by the years of lies, moves, and identity changes that had marked their teenage years. They loved their father, but also understood that his choices had cost them the chance to live normal lives with stable connections to extended family and childhood communities. Karen had built a new life for herself after divorcing Henry, but she remained connected to him through their children and their shared experiences during the witness protection years. Their relationship was polite but distant, marked by mutual understanding of what they had lost and why they had lost it. Henry's health problems were partly the result of decades of drug and alcohol abuse, but they were also the result of the stress and anxiety That had marked his life since deciding to cooperate with federal authorities. The constant fear of revenge combined with the difficulty of adjusting to legal life had taken a big physical and mental toll. Despite these problems, Henry continued to make public appearances and give interviews about his experiences. He seemed to find some comfort in telling his story and helping others understand both the appeal and the ultimate cost of criminal life. Henry also continued to work in restaurants when his health allowed, finding satisfaction in the simple pleasure of preparing good food and serving customers who appreciated his efforts. The restaurant work connected him to skills and interests that came before his criminal career and gave a feeling of connection with the person he might have been under different circumstances. Henry Hill died on June 12, 2012. In Los Angeles, where he had been living in his final years, he was 69 years old, having survived far longer than most people who had made the choices he made and lived the life he lived. The cause of death was heart disease. But Henry's health had been declining for several years due to the combined effects of decades of drug and alcohol abuse mixed with the stress of living in constant fear of revenge from former associates. Henry's death was widely reported in the media, with obituaries that focused on his role in the Lufthansa heist and his cooperation with federal authorities rather than on his later attempts to build a legal life. The coverage showed the public's continued interest in his criminal experiences and the popular culture versions of his story. His funeral was small and private, attended mainly by family members and a few friends from his legal business activities. None of his former criminal associates attended, both because most of them were dead or in prison, and because Henry's cooperation had made him permanently unwelcome in their world. The modest funeral was a sharp contrast to the fancy ceremonies that had marked important events during Henry's criminal career. There were no expensive flower arrangements, no crowds of mourners, and no displays of respect from powerful criminal organizations. Henry Hill died as Martin Lewis, a former restaurant worker with a complicated past. But Henry's death also marked the end of an era in American organized crime. He had been one of the last surviving members of the generation that had taken part in the classic heists and criminal operations of the 1960s and 1970s. His cooperation with federal authorities had helped law enforcement understand and prosecute the kind of criminal organizations that had once seemed untouchable. Henry Hill's legacy is complicated and controversial, showing the moral uncertainty of his life choices and their results for himself and others. From one point of view, he was a criminal who took part in robbery, drug trafficking, and other serious crimes that harmed innocent victims. From another point of view, he was a cooperating witness whose testimony helped law enforcement prosecute dangerous criminals and take apart criminal organizations. The popular culture versions of Henry's story, particularly the film Goodfellas, have tended to make the criminal lifestyle look exciting while downplaying its actual costs and results. The movie's focus on the excitement and friendship of criminal life has hidden the violence, fear, and ultimate destruction that marked Henry's actual experiences. For law enforcement, Henry Hill represented both a success and a warning story. His cooperation gave valuable information into organized crime operations and led to important prosecutions. But his difficulty adjusting to legal life also showed the challenges faced by cooperating witnesses who had spent their adult lives in criminal environments. Within the organized crime community, Henry Hill remained a symbol of betrayal and dishonor. His cooperation had broken the most basic rules of criminal culture, marking him as someone who couldn't be trusted to stay loyal under pressure. This reputation made sure that he could never return to the world he had once lived in, no matter how much time passed or how circumstances might change. For students of criminal justice and organized crime, Henry Hill's story gives valuable lessons about the appeal of criminal life, the dynamics of criminal organizations, and the personal costs of choosing illegal paths to success. His experiences show both why people are attracted to criminal careers and why those careers ultimately lead to results that no logical person would choose. As the sun set on Henry Hill's life, it marked the end of a story that had begun with a young boy watching wise guys from his bedroom window in Brooklyn. The kid who had dreamed of becoming a gangster had achieved everything he had first wanted: money, respect, excitement, and a place in the world of professional criminals. But Henry had also learned that criminal success carried costs that couldn't be figured out in advance and couldn't be avoided through careful planning or superior intelligence. The lifestyle that had seemed so attractive from a distance had ultimately required him to give up everything he actually valued: his relationships, his identity, his sense of belonging, and his peace of mind. The dream of being a wise guy had become a nightmare of paranoia, betrayal, and permanent exile from everything familiar. The money had been spent, the respect had been lost, and the excitement had been replaced by decades of fear and regret. Henry Hill had gotten everything he thought he wanted and learned that it wasn't worth having. He had lived every gangster's dream and discovered that it was actually every human being's nightmare. A life without trust, without peace, and without the possibility of real change. In the end, Henry Hill's story is not really about crime or law enforcement, or even about the specific events that made him famous. It's about the universal human tendency to believe that we can reach happiness and satisfaction through outside things: money, status, power, without paying attention to the inside and relational costs of our choices. Henry Hill died as he had lived for the final 30 years of his life, alone, afraid, and aware that the choices he had made as a young man had set the path of his whole life. He had wanted to be someone special, and he had succeeded. But being special had cost him the chance to be happy, to be trusted, and to be at peace with himself and his past. The kid from Brooklyn who had chosen to be a gangster rather than president of the United States had gotten exactly what he asked for. And that, perhaps, was the cruelest irony of all. In the quiet moments before dawn, when the world holds its breath between night and morning, we might imagine Henry Hill in his final years sitting alone in a small apartment in Los Angeles, thinking about the choices that had defined his life. The wise guy who had once commanded respect on the streets of New York was now just another old man with failing health and fading memories. But what memories they were! Henry had lived through the golden age of American organized crime, had taken part in some of the most amazing criminal operations of the 20th century, and had seen the rise and fall of a criminal culture that had ruled certain neighborhoods for generations. He had seen men who seemed untouchable brought low by their own success. He had watched friendships made in shared danger dissolve into mutual suspicion and fear. He had felt the exciting pleasure of unlimited money and complete power, and he had learned that both were ultimately meaningless when weighed against the simple human need for trust, belonging, and peace of mind. Henry Hill's story ends not with dramatic fights or amazing discoveries, but with the quiet understanding that every choice we make echoes through the years, shaping not just our outside circumstances, but our inside reality. The boy who had dreamed of respect and excitement had achieved both, but had discovered that they came at a price he hadn't understood and couldn't afford to pay. In choosing to be a wise guy, Henry Hill had chosen a path that seemed to offer everything a young man could want. In choosing to cooperate with federal authorities, he had chosen survival over honor. In both cases, he had made logical decisions based on the information and options available to him at the time. But logic, as Henry learned, is not the same as wisdom. Wisdom would have suggested that a life built on violence and lies could not ultimately give the security and satisfaction that make existence meaningful. Wisdom would have recognized that temporary advantages gained through criminal activity would eventually become permanent problems that no amount of money or respect could overcome. Henry Hill lived for 69 years, long enough to see his story become part of American popular culture, long enough to see the destruction of the criminal world he had once lived in, and long enough to understand that the choices we make when we're young echo through every day of the life that follows. His legacy is neither completely positive nor completely negative, but something more complicated, a reminder that the path we choose in youth often sets the destination we reach in age, and that the price of getting what we think we want may be losing what we actually need. The wise guys are mostly gone now, their world replaced by different forms of crime and different kinds of criminals. The Brooklyn neighborhoods where Henry learned to be a gangster have been changed, filled with families who have no idea what kinds of dramas once played out on their quiet streets. The Bamboo Lounge is a memory. Paul Vario is dead, and Jimmy Burke died in prison. But the story continues to matter because it captures something universal about human nature, our tendency to believe that we can reach happiness through outside means, our willingness to give up long-term peace for short-term pleasure, and our difficulty understanding that some choices once made cannot be unmade. Henry Hill chose to be a gangster instead of President of the United States. He got exactly what he asked for, and it destroyed his life. That may be the most important lesson his story has to offer. Be careful what you wish for, because in the end, you just might get it. And sometimes getting everything you thought you wanted turns out to be the cruelest fate of all. The kid from Brooklyn is gone now, but his story remains a testament to the tempting power of criminal success and the ultimate cost of choosing excitement over honor, money over relationships, and respect over peace of mind. It's a story that ends not with change or victory, but with the quiet recognition that some prices are too high to pay, no matter how attractive the goods might appear. As far back as he could remember, Henry Hill had always wanted to be a gangster. He got his wish and spent the rest of his life paying for it. In the end, that's the only tribute that really matters. He got exactly what he asked for, and it wasn't worth having. And so we reached the end of Henry Hill's amazing journey, a story that began with a 13-year-old boy pressed against a bedroom window, watching men in expensive suits leave lives that seemed touched by magic. That boy made a choice that would echo through 7 decades of American history, through the golden age of organized crime, through the largest cash robbery in history, and ultimately through the witness protection program that saved his life while destroying his identity. What did you think of Henry's story as it unfolded tonight? Here was a man who achieved everything he dreamed of as a child: the money, the respect, the power, the brotherhood, only to discover that the price of those achievements was everything he actually needed to be happy. He got the cars, the clothes, the restaurants, and the respect he had always wanted. But he lost his peace of mind, his ability to trust others, and ultimately his very sense of self. As you listened to Henry's rise from errand boy to master criminal, could you feel the tempting pull of that world? The way success led to more success, how each crime made the next one easier, how the money and respect seemed to excuse every moral compromise. That's the genius of Henry Hill's story. It helps us understand not just what happened, but why it happened. Why a smart kid from Brooklyn would choose a life that any logical analysis would show as ultimately self-destructive. I find myself wondering what you would have done in Henry's position during those final terrifying months before his arrest. Picture yourself in his shoes. You've spent 25 years building relationships with men who have become your family, your identity, your whole world. These same men have taught you that loyalty is everything, that cooperating with law enforcement is the ultimate betrayal, worse than any crime you could commit. But now those same men, your brothers, your substitute fathers, your closest friends, are planning to kill you, not because you've betrayed them, but because your continued existence threatens their freedom. The paranoia following the Lufthansa heist has made everyone dangerous to everyone else. Tommy DeSimone, your closest friend, has already disappeared. Bodies are dropping every month, and you know with complete certainty that you're next. So what do you choose? Do you keep your loyalty to a code that your supposed brothers have already broken by planning your murder? Do you accept death as the price of honor, leaving your wife and children without a husband and father? Or do you make the practical choice, the choice that saves your life but destroys your soul? Henry chose survival, and I think most of us would make the same choice in his position. But that choice came with consequences he couldn't have fully expected. He saved his life, but he lost his identity. He protected his family, but he destroyed their previous existence. He escaped death, but he sentenced himself to decades of isolation, fear, and regret. There's something deep about Henry's story that goes far beyond the world of organized crime. How many of us make choices when we're young about our careers, our relationships, our values that seem perfectly reasonable at the time, but that we later realize have shaped our whole lives in ways we never intended? Henry thought he was choosing success over poverty, excitement over boredom, respect over being ignored. He didn't understand that he was actually choosing isolation over belonging, paranoia over peace, and ultimately survival over honor. The wise guy lifestyle that looked so attractive from the outside was built on a foundation that could never support real happiness or lasting satisfaction. As you prepare to drift off to sleep tonight, I want you to think about the choices in your own life, not the dramatic, life-changing decisions that make for good stories, but the small daily choices that actually determine who we become and how we experience the world. The choice to be honest, even when lies would be easier. The choice to build relationships based on trust rather than mutual benefit. The choice to find satisfaction in simple pleasures rather than always looking for bigger thrills and greater achievements. Henry Hill's story is ultimately about the difference between getting what you want and wanting what you get. He achieved everything he thought would make him happy: wealth, power, respect, excitement, but discovered that none of those outside achievements could give the inside peace and satisfaction that make life worth living. The tragedy of Henry Hill isn't that he chose crime over honesty, though that choice certainly sealed his fate. The real tragedy is that he spent his whole life looking for happiness in places where happiness cannot be found. He looked for security in a world built on violence, for trust in relationships based on mutual use, for peace of mind in activities that required constant watchfulness and fear. In the end, Henry Hill got exactly what he asked for when he decided as a 13-year-old boy that he would rather be a gangster than President of the United States. He got the life he thought he wanted, and it destroyed him. That may be the most important lesson his story has to offer. The difference between what we think will make us happy and what actually will make us happy is often the difference between a life well lived and a life of constant regret. Where are you watching from tonight? What time is it in your part of the world? Are you settling in for sleep? Or maybe just beginning your day? Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I hope Henry Hill's story has given you something to think about. Not just about crime and punishment, not just about loyalty and betrayal, but about the choices we all make and the lives we all build through the adding up of those choices over time. If you found yourself drawn into Henry's world tonight, if you felt the appeal of that life, even while understanding its ultimate cost, then you've experienced something important about human nature. We're all attracted to stories of power and success, even when those stories end in tragedy. The key is learning to tell the difference between the fantasy of criminal success and the reality of what such choices actually cost. Thank you for joining me on this trip through one of the most interesting and tragic lives in American criminal history. Henry Hill's story is over, but the lessons it contains are timeless. Be careful what you wish for, because you just might get it. And sometimes getting everything you thought you wanted turns out to be the cruelest fate of all. Sweet dreams, and remember, sometimes the most amazing stories are the true ones. Until next time, sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with better choices than the ones Henry Hill made all those years ago.